Jack the Ripper. The Whitechapel Murders of 1888. The Autumn of Terror. In the gaslit streets of Victorian London during the autumn months of 1888, terror stalked the impoverished district of Whitechapel. 5 women were brutally murdered in a series of attacks so savage, so methodical, and so unprecedented that they would echo through history for more than a century. The killer was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. He became known to the world by a name that still sends shivers down spines today: Jack the Ripper. This is the true story of those murders, of the lives cut tragically short, of the desperate hunt for a phantom killer, and of how these crimes transformed not only criminal investigation, but Victorian society itself. These were real women with real lives, real struggles, and real deaths. What follows is not speculation or theory, but the documented facts of one of history's most infamous unsolved cases. London in 1888 stood at the apex of the British Empire, the largest city on earth, with a population exceeding 6 million people. Queen Victoria had sat upon the throne for 51 years, presiding over an era of unprecedented industrial progress, technological innovation, and imperial expansion. The British Empire spanned the globe, and London was its beating heart, a metropolis of extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary poverty existing side by side, yet worlds apart. The city itself was a study in contrasts. In the West End, grand boulevards lined with elegant townhouses housed the aristocracy and the burgeoning middle class. Gas lamps illuminated wide streets where carriages carried the wealthy to theaters, opera houses, and fashionable restaurants. New buildings rose constantly, monuments to Victorian prosperity and confidence. This was the London of music halls and concert venues, of gentlemen's clubs and refined society, where the comfortable classes enjoyed the fruits of empire while largely ignoring the festering sore that existed just a few miles to the east. For there was another London, a darker London, hidden from polite society, but home to hundreds of thousands of souls. The East End of London, particularly the districts of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, represented everything Victorian respectability tried to ignore. Here, in narrow alleys and cramped courtyards, in damp cellars and overcrowded tenements, lived the working poor, the destitute, the desperate. This was where the Whitechapel murders would take place, where 5 women would meet their terrible ends, and where a killer would earn immortality. The murders occurred during a period of just 10 weeks, between August 31st and November 9th, 1888. 5 women, all linked by poverty and circumstance, were killed in what appeared to be the work of a single individual. Their throats were cut with such force that in some cases the blade nearly severed the head from the body. But it was what happened after death that truly shocked the Victorian world. The killer mutilated his victims, removing internal organs with what appeared to be deliberate precision, leading many to suspect he possessed anatomical knowledge. The brutality was unprecedented. The mystery, unsolved to this day, became legendary. These crimes did not occur in isolation. They were the product of their time and place, of social conditions that forced vulnerable women onto the streets at night, of police methods still in their infancy, of a media landscape hungry for sensation, and of a society grappling with fears about poverty, immigration, and social disorder. To understand the Whitechapel murders, we must first understand the world in which they occurred. Whitechapel, the abyss of Victorian London. The East End of London in 1888 was home to approximately 900,000 people, with roughly 250,000 residing in Whitechapel alone. This dense concentration of humanity lived in conditions that shocked even contemporary observers. Social reformers who ventured into these districts returned with tales of squalor that seemed impossible in the capital of the world's most powerful empire. Writers like Charles Dickens and Henry Mayhew had documented the lives of the East End poor, but their warnings fell largely on deaf ears among the comfortable classes. Whitechapel had not always been synonymous with poverty and crime. Until the end of the 16th century, it had been a relatively prosperous district, but the growth of industry in the mid-18th century transformed the area. Tanneries, breweries, and foundries, industries considered too dirty or undesirable for other parts of London, established themselves in the East End. These industries attracted workers, and the workers needed housing. What followed was rapid, unplanned urban growth that created some of the worst slums in Europe. By 1888, Whitechapel was synonymous with deprivation. The streets were narrow and poorly lit, many illuminated only by flickering gas lamps that cast long shadows and left countless dark corners. Open sewers ran through many thoroughfares, and garbage piled in the streets. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of human waste, industrial pollution, and decay. Disease was rampant. Cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid, and smallpox claimed thousands of lives each year. Child mortality was staggering. Estimates suggest that 1 in 4 children born in the East End died before their 5th birthday. Housing conditions defied modern comprehension. Multiple families, sometimes 8 or 9 people, crammed into single rooms in crumbling tenements. These rooms lacked proper ventilation, had no running water, and shared communal privies that were themselves sources of disease. The buildings were damp, infested with vermin, and structurally unsound. Rents, despite the abysmal conditions, consumed most of a family's income. For those who could not afford even these miserable accommodations, there were the common lodging houses. Whitechapel contained over 200 of these establishments, providing beds for approximately 8,000 people each night. For 4p, one could rent a bed in a shared room. For 2p, one could sleep sitting up, leaning against a rope stretched across the room. These lodging houses, known colloquially as doss houses, were breeding grounds for crime, disease, and despair. They operated under minimal regulation, and their proprietors cared little for the welfare of their clientele. Approximately 15,000 people in Whitechapel were classified as homeless. These individuals had nowhere to turn. Workhouses existed, harsh institutions designed to deter the poor from seeking assistance, but many preferred the streets to the punitive regime within those walls. At night, the homeless huddled in doorways, under railway arches, in any sheltered spot they could find. They were invisible to respectable society, ghosts haunting the shadows of the empire's capital. Employment opportunities were scarce and poorly paid. Men found work at the docks when ships arrived, but such work was irregular and dependent on the tides and shipping schedules. Hundreds of men would gather at the dock gates each morning, hoping to be selected for a day's labor. Those not chosen went home empty-handed. Women had even fewer options. Some found work in factories, enduring long hours in dangerous conditions for pittance wages. Others took in piecework, sewing garments in their homes for a few pence. Many, particularly older women, or those without skills, had virtually no legitimate means of earning money. This economic desperation led many women into prostitution. The Metropolitan Police estimated in October 1888 that approximately 1,200 women of very low class were working as prostitutes in Whitechapel, with about 62 brothels operating in the area. These numbers likely understated the reality. Many women engaged in prostitution occasionally when other means of earning money failed. It was not a chosen profession, but a survival strategy, a way to earn the 4p needed for a bed, or the penny needed for bread. The women who resorted to prostitution led lives of particular misery. Most were in their 30s or 40s, but looked decades older. Years of poverty, malnutrition, and heavy drinking had taken their toll. Many were missing teeth, had skin diseases, and bore the marks of violence. They solicited customers in the streets, in alleyways, in the dark courtyards that riddled Whitechapel. For a few pence, sometimes for just a loaf of stale bread, they would accompany men into the shadows. It was dangerous work. Violence was common. Assault, rape, and robbery were occupational hazards. The police offered little protection. Society viewed these women as fallen, as moral outcasts beyond redemption. Into this world of desperation and darkness came Jack the Ripper. He found his victims among the most vulnerable members of society, women whose poverty made them easy targets, whose lifestyles meant they would accompany a stranger into the dark, whose deaths were initially viewed by some as almost inevitable consequences of their circumstances. But the manner of their deaths shocked even hardened observers. These were not ordinary murders. They were exhibitions of controlled savagery that suggested a mind both calculating and deeply disturbed. The geography of Whitechapel itself aided the killer. The district was a maze of narrow streets, courts, and alleyways. Multiple entrances and exits characterized most locations. A person could disappear into this labyrinth within seconds. The poor lighting created pools of absolute darkness where anything might happen unseen. The Metropolitan Police, understaffed and unfamiliar with effective methods for catching such a criminal, found themselves helpless. They could increase patrols, flood the area with constables, but in those dark corners, in those few moments of violence, the killer struck and vanished like a phantom. The canonical 5. The victims. 5 women are generally accepted as the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, murdered between August 31st and November 9th, 1888. These 5 deaths share striking similarities. All victims had their throats cut, all but one were extensively mutilated post-mortem, and all murders occurred in or near Whitechapel. Each of these women had a name, a history, people who knew them, and circumstances that led them to be on the streets of Whitechapel on the nights they died. They were not merely victims of a notorious killer. They were human beings whose lives deserved to be remembered. Mary Ann Nichols, the first canonical victim. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was 42 years old when she died in the early hours of Friday, August 31st, 1888. She was born Mary Ann Walker on August 26, 1845, one of several children born to a locksmith in London. In 1864, when she was 18, she married William Nichols, a printer. The marriage produced 5 children and lasted for over 20 years, but eventually dissolved, with both parties blaming the other for its failure. William claimed Mary Ann's drinking destroyed their union. Mary Ann claimed William's affair with the midwife who attended their last child's birth drove her away. After the separation, Mary Ann's life spiraled into poverty. She moved frequently, unable to maintain stable housing or employment. She worked as a domestic servant several times, but never stayed long in any position. Her drinking grew worse. She spent time in workhouses and lodging houses. By 1888, she was living a transient existence, moving between different lodging houses in Whitechapel and Spitalfields. When she could earn money through work, or increasingly through prostitution, she paid for a bed. When she could not, she slept rough. On the night of Thursday, August 30th, Mary Ann was at her lodging house at 18, Thrall Street. The deputy keeper refused her a bed because she lacked the 4pence required. Mary Ann was not concerned. She had been turned away before. She told the deputy keeper not to let her bed to anyone else, as she would soon have the money. She was seen leaving the lodging house around 1:30 in the morning, wearing a new bonnet of which she was reportedly proud. She headed toward Whitechapel Road, presumably to earn the 4pence she needed through prostitution. At approximately 3:40 in the morning of Friday, August 31st, a carter named Charles Cross was walking down Bucks Row on his way to work. In the darkness, he saw what he thought was a tarpaulin lying in a gateway. As he approached, he realized it was a woman. He called to another man, Robert Paul, who was also passing. The two men examined the woman briefly. Her clothes were disarranged, raised almost to her stomach. They pulled her skirts down for modesty and went to find a policeman. Police Constable John Neal arrived at the scene within minutes. He shone his lamp on the woman and immediately saw blood pooling beneath her neck. Her throat had been cut so deeply that the vertebrae were visible. Neal sent for a doctor and assistance. Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn arrived shortly after. He pronounced the woman dead and noted that the body was still warm, suggesting death had occurred within the last half hour. Only when the body was moved to the mortuary was the full extent of the injuries discovered. The killer had not only cut her throat, but had also mutilated her abdomen, making several deep incisions. The police identified the body as Mary Ann Nichols through her lodging house records and the attendance of her father at the mortuary. Her death was initially thought to be another tragic murder in a district where violence was common, but it would soon become apparent that this was the beginning of something far more sinister. Annie Chapman, Dark Annie's death. Annie Chapman was 47 years old when she died on Saturday, September 8, 1888. Born Annie Eliza Smith. In September 1841, she had known better times. She married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869. The couple had 3 children, though one died in infancy. For a time, they lived in Windsor, in the shadow of the royal castle, suggesting a modest but respectable life. But Annie's life, like Mary Ann Nichols's, deteriorated through alcohol and illness. She suffered from chronic lung disease and showed signs of malnutrition. Her marriage collapsed. John Chapman died in 1886, and with his death went the small allowance he had been paying her. Annie moved to Whitechapel, living in lodging houses and earning money through whatever means she could, selling flowers, doing crochet work, and, when necessary, prostitution. On Friday, September 7th, Annie was ill. Fellow lodgers saw her in the kitchen of the lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, looking weak and unwell. She told them she was too sick to do anything, but had to try to earn money regardless. That night, she attempted to get a bed at the lodging house, but lacked the necessary 8p. The deputy keeper, Timothy Donovan, had seen her drunk earlier and had removed her from the premises. When she returned asking for a bed on credit, he refused. Annie was not angry. She said, "Never mind, Tim. I'll soon be back with the money. Don't let my bed." At around 5:30 in the morning of Saturday, September 8th, Annie was seen talking to a man outside number 29 Hanbury Street. A resident of the building, Albert Kadosh, heard voices and a sound like something falling against the fence in the backyard at about that time, but thought nothing of it. Shortly before 6 o'clock, another resident, John Davis, went into the backyard and discovered Annie Chapman's body. The sight was horrific. Annie lay on her back, her skirts pushed up to her abdomen. Her throat had been cut with such violence that her head was nearly severed from her body. The killer had then mutilated her abdomen extensively, removing organs with apparent deliberation. Her intestines had been pulled out and placed over her shoulder. The uterus had been taken away entirely. Near the body, the killer had arranged items in what seemed a deliberate display: coins at her feet, a leather apron, and part of an envelope. The post-mortem examination revealed the extent of the killer's work. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, testified at the inquest that the killer had demonstrated considerable anatomical knowledge. The organs had been removed carefully, not hacked away in a frenzy. This observation led to speculation that the killer might be a doctor, a butcher, or someone with medical training. The murder had occurred in darkness. in a backyard with a fence just feet away from where people slept, yet no one heard significant sounds of struggle. The killer had completed his gruesome work in perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, then vanished into the morning. Annie Chapman's murder increased public anxiety significantly. This was the second woman killed in just over a week, both murdered in similar fashion. The police increased their presence in Whitechapel, but they had few leads. The investigation was hampered by the lack of witnesses, the absence of clear motives, and the primitive state of forensic science. Rumors began to circulate about a monster stalking the streets, and the press started paying greater attention to events in the East End. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The double event, the night of Saturday, September 29th into Sunday, September 30th, 1888, became known as the double event because the killer claimed two victims within an hour and less than a mile apart. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, and the second was Catherine Eddowes. These murders marked an escalation in the killer's activities and sent shockwaves through London and beyond. Elizabeth Stride was 44 years old when she died. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter on November 27, 1843, in Sweden, according to parish records, she had emigrated to England in her 20s. She married John Thomas Stride, a carpenter, in 1869, but the marriage ended before his death in 1884. After his death, Elizabeth claimed to be a widow of the Princess Alice disaster, a riverboat sinking that killed over 600 people in 1878. Historians have found no evidence supporting this claim, suggesting it may have been fabricated to elicit sympathy or charity. By 1888, Elizabeth was living with a man named Michael Kidney in a lodging house, though their relationship was stormy, and she frequently left him for periods. She earned money through sewing when she could, and through prostitution when necessary. She was known to be a heavy drinker, a common trait among those living in the East End's lodging houses. On the evening of Saturday, September 29th, Elizabeth was seen in the area around Berners Street, where she had been at various times throughout the evening. At 12:35 in the morning of Sunday, September 30th, a witness named Israel Schwartz reported seeing a man stop and speak to a woman he identified as Elizabeth Stride on the street. The man tried to pull her into the street, and she screamed, but not loudly. Another man standing across the street lit his pipe and watched. Schwartz, frightened, walked away quickly. Whether this incident was directly related to her murder remains uncertain. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Louis Diemschutz, a jewelry salesman, who was also the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club on Berners Street, drove his pony and cart into Dutfield's yard beside the club. His pony shied at something in the darkness. Diemschutz climbed down and struck a match. In the flickering light, he saw a woman lying on the ground. He initially thought she was drunk, but then he saw blood. The body was Elizabeth Stride. Her throat had been cut, severing her left carotid artery, but unlike the previous victims, she had not been mutilated. The absence of abdominal injuries led to immediate speculation among investigators. Some believed the killer had been interrupted by Diemschutz's arrival and had fled before completing his work. Others argued that the differences suggested a different killer altogether. Modern researchers remain divided on this question. What followed within the hour suggested the former interpretation might be correct. Just 45 minutes after Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered, and less than a mile away in Mitre Square within the City of London, the killer struck again. Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old when she died. Born Catherine Conway on April 14, 1842 in Wolverhampton, she had lived with a man named Thomas Conway for over 20 years and had 3 children with him. The relationship ended around 1880, and Catherine then entered into a relationship with John Kelly, with whom she lived until her death. They were a pair of transient workers, moving around Kent picking hops in season and returning to London, where they stayed at a lodging house in Flower and Dean Street. On the night of September 29th, Catherine had been arrested for being drunk and was held at Bishopsgate Police Station to sober up. She was released at 1 o'clock in the morning of September 30th, told to pull herself together. She left the station and walked toward Mitre Square. That walk, just a few hundred yards, would be her last. At 1:44 in the morning, Police Constable Edward Watkins walked through Mitre Square on his regular beat. The square was empty. Watkins continued his patrol, a circular route that took approximately 12 to 14 minutes. When he returned to Mitre Square at 1:55, he found Catherine Eddowes' body lying in the southwest corner. The mutilations inflicted upon Catherine Eddowes were the most extensive yet. Her throat had been cut deeply. Her abdomen had been ripped open from the breastbone to the pelvis. The killer had removed organs. The left kidney was taken, as was most of the uterus. He had also mutilated her face, making deliberate cuts that formed a V pattern on her cheeks and cutting her eyelids and nose. These facial mutilations were new, adding another disturbing element to the killer's apparent evolution. The speed with which this murder was committed was remarkable. Police Constable Watkins had been gone from the square for less than 15 minutes. In that brief window, the killer had approached Catherine, cut her throat, performed extensive mutilations in near total darkness, removed organs, and escaped without being seen. The square had 3 entrances, any of which the killer might have used. Despite the proximity of occupied buildings and the regular police patrols, no one saw or heard anything conclusive. The investigation into Catherine Eddowes' murder provided one of the few potential clues in the entire case. As police searched the immediate area after discovering the body, a piece of her blood-stained apron was found in a doorway on Goulston Street, about a third of a mile from Mitre Square. Above the apron fragment, written in chalk on the wall, was a message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This graffito immediately caused concern among the police. Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, feared it might incite anti-Semitic violence and ordered it erased before it could be photographed, a decision that has frustrated investigators ever since. Whether the message was written by the killer or was already present on the wall remains a matter of debate. The double event convinced many that a single killer was responsible for all the murders. The attacks on Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, occurring within such a short time and space, suggested a perpetrator driven by an overwhelming compulsion. The press coverage intensified. The name Jack the Ripper had just entered public consciousness through the "Dear Boss" letter, and the double event seemed to fulfill the letter's promise of continuing violence. Mary Jane Kelly, the final victim. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the canonical victims, only 25 years old when she died on Friday, November 9th, 1888. She was also the only victim killed indoors, and the mutilations performed on her body exceeded anything that had come before, suggesting that the killer, working without time constraints in a private space, unleashed the full extent of his depravity. Mary Jane Kelly's background is more obscure than the other victims. She provided stories about her past to friends and acquaintances, but many details cannot be independently verified. She claimed to have been born in Limerick, Ireland, to have moved to Wales as a child, and to have married a collier named Davies, who died in a mining accident. She claimed to have later worked in a high-class brothel in the West End, and even to have traveled to Paris before returning to the East End. Historians have been unable to confirm most of these details, leaving her true history uncertain. What is certain is that by 1888, Mary Jane Kelly was living in a single room at 13 Miller's Court, a small enclosed courtyard off Dorset Street. She paid 4 shillings and 6pence per week in rent, but was significantly in arrears. She lived with a man named Joseph Barnett, a fish porter. but he had moved out on October 30th following an argument. After his departure, Mary Jane likely resumed prostitution to earn money. On the evening of Thursday, November 8th, Mary Jane was seen in the area around Miller's Court. She was described as being drunk by some witnesses. Around 2 o'clock in the morning of Friday, November 9th, a neighbor, Mary Ann Cox, saw her returning to her room with a man. Cox described him as stout, shabbily dressed, with a blotchy face and a carroty mustache. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, another resident reported hearing a cry of "murder." But such cries were not uncommon in that neighborhood, and no one investigated. At 10:45 in the morning, the landlord's assistant, Thomas Bowyer, went to number 13 Miller's Court to collect the overdue rent. Getting no answer at the door, he reached through a broken window pane, pushed aside a coat being used as a makeshift curtain, and looked inside. What he saw sent him running in horror to fetch the police. Mary Jane Kelly's body lay on the bed. The injuries were so extensive that she was almost unrecognizable as human. The killer had removed all her clothing and had spent considerable time mutilating her body. Her throat was cut down to the spine. Her entire abdominal cavity had been emptied, the organs removed. Her face had been hacked beyond recognition. Flesh had been removed from her thighs. Her breasts had been cut off and placed beside her body. Her internal organs were arranged around her in what appeared to be a deliberate display. Some organs, including her heart, were missing entirely and were never found. The horror of the scene suggested that the killer had spent hours with the body. Working in the privacy of the room, with a fire burning in the grate, he had given free rein to his impulses. Dr. Thomas Bond, who performed the post-mortem examination, estimated that the mutilations would have taken at least 2 hours to complete, though this assessment was based on the extent of the injuries rather than direct evidence. The killer had worked methodically, almost surgically, in a scene of carnage that shocked even experienced police officers and medical examiners. Mary Jane Kelly's murder was the last of the canonical five. After November 9, 1888, no more murders occurred with the same characteristics. The sudden cessation of the killings has led to endless speculation among researchers and investigators. Theories suggest the killer may have died, been imprisoned for another crime, left the country, or simply stopped killing. Without definitive evidence, these questions remain unanswered. What is certain is that the Autumn of Terror had ended, leaving behind 5 mutilated bodies, a city gripped by fear, and a mystery that would endure for generations. Beyond the canonical 5, other Whitechapel murders. While 5 victims are generally accepted as the canonical Ripper murders, the Metropolitan Police's Whitechapel murders file actually contained 11 names, covering deaths from April 1888 to February 1891. The question of which, if any, of the other 6 victims were killed by Jack the Ripper remains debated. Each case has its proponents and skeptics, and examining these murders provides important context for understanding the canonical 5. Emma Elizabeth Smith was the first name in the Whitechapel murders file. On Easter Monday, April 2, 1888, the 45-year-old prostitute was attacked by a gang in the early hours of the morning. She survived long enough to walk back to her lodging house at 18 George Street and to report that she had been assaulted by 2 or 3 men, one of them a teenager. She was taken to London Hospital, where doctors discovered that a blunt object had been inserted into her vagina, rupturing her peritoneum. She died of peritonitis the following day. Most experts do not consider Emma Smith a Ripper victim. She explicitly stated she was attacked by multiple assailants, and the nature of the assault differed significantly from the Ripper murders. However, Detective Constable Walter Dew, who worked on the case, later wrote in his memoirs that he believed Smith might have been the Ripper's first victim, though he did not provide clear reasoning for this belief. Most modern researchers discount the connection, viewing the attack on Emma Smith as likely perpetrated by a gang assault, possibly by pimps or protection racketeers, though her attackers were never identified. Martha Tabram, also known as Martha Turner, was found dead on Tuesday, August 7, 1888, on the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings. The 39-year-old prostitute had been stabbed 39 times with what appeared to be 2 different weapons. The frenzied nature of the attack led some to link it to the Ripper murders, and for many years, Martha Tabram was considered a possible Ripper victim. However, the differences between Martha's murder and the later canonical 5 are significant. She was stabbed, not cut. Her clothing was disarranged, but she was not mutilated in the same manner as the later victims. Her throat was not cut. These differences have led many experts to conclude that while Martha Tabram's murder was brutal and occurred in the same area, it was likely committed by someone else. Some researchers have suggested that her killer may have been a soldier from the nearby Tower of London, a theory based on the nature of the stab wounds and witness reports of soldiers in the area that night, though this remains unproven. After the canonical 5 murders, 3 more deaths were added to the Whitechapel murders file. Rose Milett, also known as Catherine Milett and nicknamed Drunken Lizzie Davis, was found strangled in Clark's Yard, Poplar, on December 20, 1888. The 26 or 29-year-old woman, her exact age remains uncertain in records, had been drinking heavily. The initial police assessment was that she had accidentally hanged herself with her collar while in a drunken stupor, or possibly committed suicide. However, faint marks on her neck suggested possible strangulation, and the inquest returned a verdict of murder. Most experts do not connect Rose Milett's death to the Ripper. There were no knife wounds, no mutilations, and the circumstances differed significantly from the canonical murders. The method of death and the lack of characteristic mutilations suggest a different perpetrator, if indeed it was murder at all, rather than misadventure. Alice Mackenzie, known as Clay Pipe Alice, was found dead in Castle Alley on July 17, 1889. The 40-year-old woman had her throat cut and exhibited several small cuts to her abdomen. The attack bore some superficial resemblance to the Ripper murders, leading to speculation that Jack the Ripper had returned after an 8-month hiatus. However, the nature and extent of the injuries differed from the canonical 5. The cuts were shallower, more numerous, but less systematic. Dr. Thomas Bond believed Mackenzie might be a Ripper victim, but Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who had examined several of the canonical victims, disagreed, noting significant differences in technique. Most researchers today believe Alice Mackenzie was not a Ripper victim. The injuries, while superficially similar, lack the characteristic deep mutilations and organ removal that mark the canonical 5. It is possible that her killer was attempting to emulate the Ripper's methods, or that this was an unrelated murder that happened to occur in the same area. Frances Coles was the last name in the Whitechapel murders file. The 26-year-old prostitute was found beneath a railway arch in Swallow Gardens on February 13, 1891. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the Ripper victims, she appeared to have been alive when Police Constable Ernest Thompson discovered her. She died shortly after. There were no abdominal mutilations. The police arrested a sailor named Thomas Sadler and seriously considered him as a suspect not only for Frances Coles's murder, but potentially for the earlier Ripper murders as well. Sadler had been seen with Coles in the days before her death, had been involved in drunken altercations, and had sold a knife shortly after the murder. However, the case against him collapsed upon investigation, and he was released. Frances Coles's murder remains officially unsolved, but most experts do not believe it was the work of Jack the Ripper. The method, the circumstances, and the timing all differ too significantly from the canonical 5. In addition to these victims, some researchers have pointed to other murders and attacks that might have been early attempts by the Ripper or additional victims not included in the official file. Ada Wilson was attacked and stabbed in her throat at her home on March 28, 1888. She survived. Annie Millwood was attacked and stabbed in February 1888 and died in the South Grove Workhouse in March from causes related to the attack. Neither of these attacks exhibits the characteristics of the canonical Ripper murders, but some theorists argue they might represent the killer's early, less developed methods. The debate over the exact number of Ripper victims will likely never be conclusively resolved. What can be stated with reasonable confidence is that 5 women, the canonical 5, were almost certainly killed by the same person. Whether that person killed others remains an open question, but the evidence for additional victims is significantly weaker than for the core 5. The police investigation, a study in frustration. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders represented one of the largest manhunts in Victorian England and tested the limits of contemporary police methods. Despite deploying hundreds of officers, conducting thousands of interviews, and pursuing countless leads, the Metropolitan Police never identified the killer. The failure to solve the case had lasting consequences for public confidence in the police and for the careers of several senior officers. The responsibility for investigating the Whitechapel murders fell primarily to the Metropolitan Police, specifically the H Division, based in Whitechapel. The investigation was initially led by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed, an experienced officer who knew the East End well. After the murder of Ann Nichols, Scotland Yard sent reinforcements including Detective Inspector Frederick Abberline, Detective Inspector Henry Moore, and Detective Inspector Walter Andrews. Abberline, who had previously served in Whitechapel before being promoted to Scotland Yard, would become the most famous of the investigators, though his role has sometimes been exaggerated in popular accounts. Sir Charles Warren was the Metropolitan Police Commissioner at the time, a military man who had come to the role after service in the British Army. Warren was not popular with either his officers or the public. He was perceived as authoritarian and out of touch, more suited to military command than civilian policing. His decision to erase the Goulston Street graffito before it could be photographed has been particularly criticized by historians. Warren resigned on November 8, 1888, the day before Mary Jane Kelly's murder, though his resignation was not related to the Ripper case, but rather to a long-running dispute with the Home Office over his authority. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson was the head of the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, during the murders. His absence during a crucial period hampered the investigation. Anderson was on leave in Switzerland between September 7th and October 6th, a period during which 3 of the canonical 5 murders occurred: Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. In Anderson's absence, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was appointed to coordinate the investigation from Scotland Yard. Swanson would become one of the most important figures in the case, though he worked largely behind the scenes, reading reports, coordinating information, and attempting to identify patterns. The police investigation followed the methods available at the time. Officers canvassed the neighborhoods where the murders occurred, knocking on doors, questioning residents, and seeking witnesses. They interviewed known criminals and suspicious persons. They consulted doctors and surgeons to determine whether the killer might have medical knowledge. They increased uniformed patrols in Whitechapel, flooding the area with officers in an attempt to either catch the killer in the act or deter him from striking again. Plainclothes detectives mingled with the crowds in Whitechapel, hoping to observe suspicious behavior. Police even disguised themselves as women in an attempt to bait the killer, a strategy that was both dangerous and ultimately fruitless. The police bulletin boards displayed sketches of suspects based on witness descriptions, though these descriptions often conflicted and the sketches varied widely. One of the major obstacles facing the investigation was the primitive state of forensic science. The murders occurred 14 years before fingerprinting was adopted by Scotland Yard. No DNA analysis existed. Photography was used to document crime scenes, but only in limited cases. Mary Jane Kelly's crime scene was photographed, providing some of the most disturbing images associated with the case. But earlier crime scenes were not preserved in this manner. Post-mortem examinations were conducted, but the medical knowledge of the time limited what could be learned. Doctors could describe the wounds and attempt to determine the type of weapon used, but they could not provide information about the killer's identity. The removal of organs led to speculation about anatomical knowledge, but this remained speculation. Some doctors believed the killer demonstrated medical training, while others argued that a butcher or slaughterman would have similar knowledge. The police also had to contend with internal problems. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police were separate entities, and Catherine Eddowes' murder in Mitre Square fell under the City Police's jurisdiction. While the two forces cooperated, they also competed, and information was not always shared effectively. Within the Metropolitan Police itself, there were disagreements about investigative approaches and tensions between senior officers. Public pressure on the police was immense. The press constantly criticized their efforts, accusing them of incompetence and failure. Citizens groups formed, such as the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by George Lusk, attempting to supplement police patrols and pressuring the government to offer rewards for information. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, refused to offer rewards, citing past experiences where rewards had led to false accusations and unreliable information. But this decision was unpopular and increased criticism of the police. The investigation pursued numerous suspects. Men were arrested, questioned, and released. Many had alibis. Others were eliminated because witness descriptions did not match. Some suspects were investigated posthumously. The police files mentioned several individuals they considered suspicious, though the evidence against each was circumstantial at best. The most famous named suspects, Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog, were not identified until years after the murders ceased, in a memorandum written by Assistant Chief Constable Melville McNacton in 1894. Despite hundreds of officers working on the case, despite thousands of hours of investigation, the killer was never identified. The murders simply stopped after Mary Jane Kelly's death in November 1888. Whether the killer died, was imprisoned for another crime, left the country, or simply ceased his activities remains unknown. The investigation officially remained open, and for years afterward, any similar murder in the area prompted speculation about the Ripper's return. But the Autumn of Terror had ended. The Ripper Letters. Correspondence from Hell. During the autumn of 1888 and the years that followed, the Metropolitan Police, City of London Police, and various newspapers received hundreds of letters purporting to be from the Whitechapel murderer. The vast majority were obvious hoaxes, pranks, or attempts to gain attention. Some were sent by journalists seeking to create stories. Others came from mentally disturbed individuals or people with cruel senses of humor. Amid this deluge of correspondence, 3 letters stand out as historically significant, not necessarily because they were genuine, but because of their impact on the case and their role in creating the legend of Jack the Ripper. The Dear Boss letter was dated September 25, 1888, and was received by the Central News Agency on September 27th. The letter was written in red ink, though claims that it was written in blood proved false. The handwriting was steady, the tone mocking and boastful. The writer claimed to be the Whitechapel murderer and promised to continue killing. The letter contained phrases that would become famous. "I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was." The writer apologized for not sending the letter sooner because he had red ink on his hands, and he promised in his next job to clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly. The letter was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper," and included a postscript. "Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now." This was the first recorded use of the name Jack the Ripper. Initially, the Central News Agency and the police considered the letter a hoax, one of many such communications they had received. However, 3 days after the letter was received, the double event occurred. When Catherine Eddowes' body was discovered with a portion of her earlobe cut away, the "Dear Boss" letter suddenly seemed more significant. The writer had promised to clip ears, and now a victim had suffered that exact mutilation. The police made the letter public, publishing facsimiles in newspapers and on handbills, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting. Instead of producing leads, this decision triggered an avalanche of copycat letters. Hundreds of people wrote to the police claiming to be Jack the Ripper, many copying phrases and style from the "Dear Boss" letter. The name Jack the Ripper was picked up by the press and quickly became the standard way to refer to the Whitechapel murderer. Within days of the "Dear Boss" letter being publicized, another communication arrived. On October 1st, 1888, the Central News Agency received a postcard, also written in red ink and bearing what appeared to be bloodstains. The postcard, known as the "Saucy Jackie" postcard, read, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow." Double event this time. Number 1 squealed. A bit couldn't finish straight off, had not the time to get ears for police. "Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again." The reference to a double event and the claim about not having time to finish seemed to refer to the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Elizabeth Stride had not been mutilated, which some investigators believed was because the killer had been interrupted. The postcard appeared to confirm this theory. The handwriting was similar to the "Dear Boss" letter, suggesting the same author. The "Dear Boss" letter and "Saucy Jackie" postcard are now generally believed to have been hoaxes, likely written by a journalist or journalists seeking to create a more sensational story. In 1931, journalist Fred Best allegedly confessed that he and a colleague, Tom Bullen, had written the letters to keep the business alive, though the authenticity of this confession itself has been questioned by some researchers. Most experts agree the letters were not written by the actual killer, based on linguistic analysis and the suspicious timing of their receipt, which always coincided with periods when police or press needed new angles for stories. However, one letter has proven harder to dismiss. The "From Hell" letter, received by George Lusk on October 16, 1888. Lusk was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a citizens group that had formed to assist police efforts and pressure the government into offering rewards. On October 15th, Lusk received a small cardboard box in the post. Inside was half of a human kidney preserved in wine, along with a letter. The letter was brief and written in a crude, nearly illiterate hand. It read, "From Hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you t'other piece I fried and ate. It was very knees. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wot a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk." Catherine Eddowes had her left kidney removed during her murder. Could this be the missing organ? Lusk took the kidney to Dr. Frederick Wiles, who referred it to Dr. Thomas Openshaw at the London hospital. Openshaw examined it and determined it was human, from the left side, and from a woman of about 45 years, matching Catherine Eddowes' age. However, he could not definitively state it was Eddowes' kidney. Some doctors argued the kidney showed signs of Bright's disease and had been preserved in spirits, leading them to suggest it came from a medical specimen. Others believed it could have been genuine based on its condition and characteristics. The debate over the From Hell letter's authenticity continues. The handwriting differed from the Dear Boss letter, suggesting a different author. The crude language and poor spelling might indicate someone with little education, unlike the more literate Dear Boss writer. Some experts believe the From Hell letter might be genuine, the only actual communication from the killer. Others argue it was another hoax, perhaps perpetrated by a medical student with access to anatomical specimens. Beyond these three famous letters, hundreds of others arrived, at police stations and newspaper offices. Some were threats directed at specific individuals. Some were confessions. Many were crude attempts at humor or attention-seeking. A few were disturbing enough to warrant investigation, but none led to the killer's identification. The letters became part of the Ripper legend, adding to the sense that the killer was taunting the police, playing a game with them. Whether any of the letters were genuine remains uncertain, but their impact on the case and on public perception was undeniable. Media frenzy: how newspapers created a legend. The Whitechapel murders occurred at a pivotal moment in the history of journalism. The late Victorian period saw the rise of what became known as new journalism, characterized by sensational reporting, human interest stories, and a focus on crime and scandal. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers, and the Ripper murders provided exactly the kind of story that sold copies. The interplay between the press and the murders transformed what might have been a local crime story into an international phenomenon. By 1888, London supported numerous daily and weekly newspapers representing different political viewpoints and targeting different social classes. The Times and the Daily Telegraph appealed to educated middle-class and upper-class readers. The Star, launched in 1888, targeted a working-class audience with cheaper prices and more sensational content. The Illustrated Police News, a weekly publication founded in 1864, specialized in crime stories and featured graphic illustrations of murders, executions, and scandals. The murders began receiving significant attention after Annie Chapman's death on September 8th. The similarities between her murder and Ann Nichols' murder a week earlier suggested a pattern, and newspapers began speculating about a serial killer. The term serial killer would not be coined until the 20th century, but the concept of a killer who struck repeatedly without apparent motive was beginning to emerge in public consciousness. Coverage of the murders varied by publication. The Times and Daily Telegraph focused on the failure of law and order, using the murders to criticize the police and local authorities. These papers emphasized the need for better policing and the dangers of allowing areas like Whitechapel to descend into lawlessness. The Star and other papers aimed at working-class readers emphasized the social conditions in the East End, calling for reforms to address poverty and improve living conditions. The Illustrated Police News and similar publications focused on the lurid details of the crimes, featuring graphic illustrations of the murder scenes and speculative drawings of the killer. At the height of the investigation, newspapers were selling up to 1 million copies per day, unprecedented numbers at the time. Street vendors hawked papers with cries of "Jack the Ripper latest news." The murders dominated front pages and inspired numerous editorial pieces. Papers competed to provide the most shocking details, the most sensational theories, and the most dramatic illustrations. Journalists flocked to Whitechapel to report on the murders firsthand. Many were shocked by the conditions they found. The gap between the poverty of the East End and the comfort of the West End, always present but often ignored, became impossible to overlook. Some journalists wrote sympathetically about the victims, emphasizing their humanity and the circumstances that had driven them to the streets. Others portrayed them more judgmentally, as fallen women whose lifestyles had led inevitably to tragedy. The speed with which newspapers could respond to events was remarkable. When Catherine Eddowes was murdered in the early hours of September 30th, Lloyd's Weekly received information at 2:10 in the morning, just 20 minutes after the body was discovered. By 4 o'clock, the editor had a special edition printing so the news could reach Sunday breakfast tables. This rapid reporting was made possible by the telegraph, which allowed information to travel almost instantaneously, and by improved printing technology that enabled quick production of large print runs. The press also contributed to the creation of suspects and theories. Newspapers published letters from readers suggesting various explanations for the murders. Theories ranged from the plausible to the bizarre. Some argued the killer was a doctor or medical student. Others suggested a butcher or slaughterman. More outlandish theories proposed the killer was an escaped lunatic, a member of the aristocracy slumming in the East End, or even a woman disguised as a man. Anti-Semitic sentiment, already present in the East End due to recent waves of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, was amplified by some press coverage. After the discovery of the Goulston Street graffito mentioning Jews, some papers suggested the killer might be Jewish. The early suspect, nicknamed Leather Apron, later identified as John Pizer, was rumored to be Jewish. When Pizer was cleared, some newspapers reluctantly accepted his innocence, but the association between the murders and the Jewish community had been established in some minds, leading to harassment and threats against Jewish residents of the East End. The decision by the Central News Agency and subsequently the police to publicize the Dear Boss letter and Saucy Jackie postcard had enormous consequences. The name Jack the Ripper captured the public imagination in a way that the Whitechapel murderer, or Leather Apron, had not. It was catchy, memorable, and suggested a certain theatrical quality to the killer. Whether the name was coined by the killer himself or by a journalist seeking to create a more marketable story, its adoption by the press ensured it would endure. Newspapers also published the letters themselves, reproducing the handwriting and encouraging readers to come forward if they recognized it. This well-intentioned effort to aid the investigation instead triggered hundreds of copycat letters, overwhelming the police with useless correspondence and making it nearly impossible to identify potentially genuine communications. The international dimension of the press coverage was unprecedented. Telegraph cables connected Britain to the rest of the world, and stories about the Ripper appeared in newspapers in the United States, Europe, Australia, and beyond. Jack the Ripper became the first internationally famous serial killer, known from New York to Sydney. This global coverage helped cement the murders in the collective imagination and contributed to the enduring fascination with the case. Critics at the time and since have argued that the press coverage was exploitative and sensationalistic, that it prioritized sales over accuracy and ethics. There is truth to these criticisms. Much of the reporting was exaggerated. False information was printed as fact. Witnesses were misquoted or had their statements embellished. Artists created illustrations of crime scenes they had never visited, imagining details to make their drawings more dramatic. However, the press coverage also served important purposes. It brought attention to the appalling conditions in the East End, something social reformers had been trying to achieve for years. The murders forced comfortable middle-class and upper-class Londoners to confront the existence of extreme poverty in their city. George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and social critic, famously wrote that, "Whilst we conventional social democrats were wasting our time on education, agitation, and organization, some independent genius has taken the matter in hand, and by simply murdering and disemboweling 4 women, converted the proprietary press to an inept sort of communism." Shaw's sardonic observation captured a dark truth. The murders achieved what reformers had failed to do. They made the problems of the East End impossible to ignore. The publicity generated by the press coverage led to public pressure for social reform, contributing to legislation such as the Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1890, which attempted to address slum conditions. The media's role in the Jack the Ripper case set precedents that continue today. The murders demonstrated the power of the press to shape public perception of crime, to create celebrities, even criminal celebrities, and to influence police investigations. The relationship between crime, media, and public fascination that characterized the Ripper coverage remains recognizable in modern true crime coverage. The suspects. Who was Jack the Ripper? The question of Jack the Ripper's identity has obsessed researchers, historians, and amateur detectives for over a century. More than 100 suspects have been proposed, ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Some theories are based on contemporary police suspicions, others on evidence uncovered years later, and still others on pure speculation. Despite extensive investigation, no theory has ever been definitively proven, and the killer's identity remains one of history's great mysteries. The most important historical suspects are those named in contemporary police files or by officers who worked on the case. In 1894, 6 years after the murders ceased, Assistant Chief Constable Melville McNacton wrote a memorandum responding to newspaper articles that suggested a man named Thomas Cutbush was the Ripper. McNacton refuted this claim, and in doing so, named 3 men he considered more likely suspects: Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher from a respectable family in Dorset. Born on August 15, 1857, Druitt was educated at Oxford and called to the bar in 1885. He supplemented his income by teaching at a boarding school in Blackheath. In late November 1888, he was dismissed from his teaching position for reasons that remain unclear. On December 4, 1888, his body was found floating in the Thames near Chiswick. He had drowned himself, weighting his pockets with stones. He had been missing since early December. McNacton claimed that Druitt was sexually insane and stated that his own family suspected him of being the Ripper, though the source of this information remains unclear. The timing of his suicide, occurring about 3 weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the last of the canonical 5, appeared significant to McNacton. If Druitt was indeed the killer, his death would explain why the murders stopped. However, the case against Druitt is weak. McNacton's memorandum contained several factual errors. He stated Druitt was 41 and a doctor, when in fact Druitt was 31 and a barrister. No evidence suggests Druitt possessed medical knowledge. No contemporary documents link him to the case. He was not mentioned by officers who worked the investigation in 1888. His presence in Whitechapel at the times of the murders is unverified. He lived and worked in Blackheath, several miles from Whitechapel, though this does not preclude his traveling to the East End. The strongest argument against Druitt is the lack of any evidence beyond McNacton's claim about family suspicions, which cannot be verified. Druitt's suicide might simply have been coincidentally timed. Depression and mental instability ran in his family. Both his mother and grandmother suffered from mental illness. His dismissal from his teaching position and the family history might have driven him to suicide without any connection to the murders. Aaron Kosminski presents a more intriguing case. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. Born on September 11, 1865, according to asylum records, he emigrated to England in the early 1880s. He lived in Whitechapel during the time of the murders, placing him in the right location. In 1891, he was committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum after threatening his sister with a knife. Kosminski was named as a suspect not only in McNacton's memorandum, but also in the marginal notes of Chief Inspector Donald Swanson and in the memoirs of Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Anderson wrote that the police had identified the killer as a low-class Polish Jew. and that a witness had identified him but refused to testify against a fellow Jew. Swanson's notes elaborated, claiming Kosminski was watched at his brother's house, then taken to a workhouse, and finally to an asylum, where he died shortly after. However, the evidence against Kosminski is problematic. Aaron Kosminski did not die shortly after being committed. He lived until 1919. The description of his symptoms in asylum records suggests paranoid schizophrenia characterized by auditory hallucinations and refusal to wash, but not homicidal violence. Within the asylum, he was described as harmless. His refusal to wash contradicts Anderson's description of the suspect, whom he described as having been cleaned up for the identification. In recent years, Aaron Kosminski has received renewed attention due to claims about DNA evidence. In 2014, businessman Russell Edwards published a book claiming to have proven Kosminski's guilt through DNA testing of a shawl allegedly taken from Catherine Eddowes' crime scene. The shawl supposedly bore bloodstains matching Eddowes and semen matching a descendant of Kosminski. However, the provenance of the shawl has been questioned. There is no documentation proving it came from the crime scene. The DNA testing methodology has been criticized by scientists, and the published peer-reviewed article about the findings drew an expression of concern from the journal due to errors and questionable conclusions. Most experts remain skeptical of these DNA claims. It is also possible that the police confused Aaron Kosminski with another individual. Some researchers have suggested that the real suspect might have been a different Polish-Jewish immigrant named Nathan Kamiński, or David Cohen, who was a violent patient at Colney Hatch Asylum and died in 1889. The theory is that police confused the names, leading to Aaron Kosminski being named as the suspect when the real individual was someone else entirely. Michael Ostrog, the third suspect named in McNaughton's memorandum, is the least compelling. Described as a Russian doctor and a convict who was frequently detained in asylums, Ostrog was a confidence trickster with a long criminal record. However, there is no evidence he was in London during the murders. Records suggest he was imprisoned in France during at least some of the relevant period. Why McNaughton included him remains unclear. Most researchers dismiss Ostrog as a viable suspect. Beyond McNaughton's three suspects, numerous others have been proposed. Francis Tumblety was an Irish-American quack doctor who was in London during the murders. He was arrested in November 1888 for gross indecency, homosexual offenses, and fled to the United States while on bail. Chief Inspector John Littlechild mentioned Tumblety in a letter written in 1913, describing him as a likely suspect. Tumblety had a known hatred of women and collected uteri in jars, supposedly as part of a medical collection. However, he was 56 years old in 1888 and physically large, which does not match most witness descriptions of the suspect, who was typically described as being of medium build and younger. George Chapman, born Severin Klasowski, was a Polish immigrant and barber who lived in Whitechapel during the murders. He was executed in 1903 for poisoning 3 women. Inspector Frederick Abberline reportedly believed Chapman might have been the Ripper. However, the method of killing, poison versus knife attacks, is dramatically different, and serial killers rarely change their methods so fundamentally. Most experts discount this theory. More controversial and speculative suspects include members of the British aristocracy, such as Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, who was Queen Victoria's grandson. This theory, popularized by various sensational books, lacks any credible evidence and has been thoroughly debunked. Prince Albert Victor had alibis for the murder dates, and there is no legitimate reason to suspect him beyond sensational storytelling. Walter Sickert, the Victorian artist, has been proposed as a suspect, most notably by crime writer Patricia Cornwell. Cornwell spent millions investigating Sickert, but her conclusions rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and interpretations of his artwork. Most ripperologists do not find her arguments convincing. Other suspects have included an American serial killer, H.H. Holmes, based on timing and handwriting analysis that has not been widely accepted. Various unnamed medical students, slaughterhouse workers, and even a suggestion that the killer might have been a woman, Mary Piercy, who killed another woman and her baby in 1890, has been proposed, though the evidence is extremely weak. The truth is that we do not know who Jack the Ripper was. We may never know. The passage of time has erased evidence, destroyed documents, and removed the possibility of finding conclusive proof. The police files that survived are incomplete. Many documents were lost, stolen, or destroyed over the years. Witness descriptions were often contradictory. Forensic evidence was limited and poorly preserved by modern standards. What we can say with reasonable confidence, based on the evidence, is that the killer was likely a resident of or frequent visitor to the East End, who knew the area's geography well. The murders were committed in locations that required knowledge of the streets, courts, and escape routes. The killer was able to approach vulnerable women and persuade them to accompany him into dark, secluded spots, suggesting he appeared relatively normal and unthreatening. The mutilations suggest someone comfortable with blood and with using a knife, though whether this indicates medical training or simply experience with slaughtering animals remains a subject of debate among researchers. The killer operated alone, unlike many of the crimes in the East End, which were committed by gangs. He struck quickly and then disappeared into the labyrinth of Whitechapel streets. He was never caught at a crime scene, never definitively identified by a witness, and never apprehended. Whether he died, moved away, was imprisoned for another crime, or simply stopped killing remains unknown. Jack the Ripper remains a phantom, a shadow, known only by his crimes. Social impact and reform. The Ripper's unexpected legacy. The Jack the Ripper murders had consequences far beyond the deaths of 5 women. The intense publicity, the media coverage, and the public terror they generated brought unprecedented attention to the social conditions in London's East End. In a grim irony, the murders achieved what social reformers had been attempting for years. They forced Victorian society to confront the reality of poverty, inadequate housing, and social neglect that characterized districts like Whitechapel. The East End had long been home to social reformers and philanthropists attempting to improve conditions for the poor. Organizations like the Salvation Army, founded by William Booth, worked tirelessly to provide aid and spiritual guidance. Individual reformers wrote books and pamphlets describing the conditions they witnessed. Charles Dickens's novels had depicted London poverty decades earlier, and Henry Mayhew's investigations into the lives of the poor provided detailed documentation of their struggles. Yet these efforts, while acknowledged by some, failed to generate widespread public concern or meaningful governmental response. The Ripper murders changed this. Journalists who came to Whitechapel to report on the crimes were confronted by the reality of the East End. Many wrote not only about the murders, but about the social conditions that provided the context for them. Articles appeared describing the overcrowded lodging houses, the crumbling tenements, the lack of sanitation, the poverty that drove women to prostitution. These articles reached audiences who had never thought about the East End and who now saw it as a festering problem that could no longer be ignored. The satirical magazine Punch published a famous cartoon titled The Nemesis of Neglect in September 1888. The image showed a tall, dark figure with a knife stalking through a slum alley, with the caption suggesting that poverty and neglect had created this monster. The cartoon captured what many reformers believed, that Jack the Ripper was not an aberration, but a product of social conditions, an inevitable result of allowing such deprivation to exist unchecked. George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and socialist, made this point explicitly in his letter titled Blood Money to Whitechapel, published in The Star. Shaw sardonically noted that the murders had done what reformers could not, bringing public attention to East End conditions and prompting discussion of social justice. His comment, while dark, contained truth. The murders galvanized public opinion in a way that reasoned arguments about housing reform had not. This public pressure contributed to legislative changes. The Housing of the Working Classes, Act 1890, was passed partly in response to the conditions highlighted by the Ripper coverage. The act provided local authorities with powers to acquire and demolish slum housing and to build replacement housing for working-class families. While implementation was slow and inconsistent, it represented an acknowledgement at the governmental level that housing conditions in places like Whitechapel required intervention. The murders also had effects on law enforcement. The failure to catch the Ripper led to public criticism of the Metropolitan Police and contributed to reforms in police procedures. The investigation, while ultimately unsuccessful, prompted police to develop better methods for coordinating investigations, sharing information between divisions, and conducting systematic searches. The experience gained during the Ripper investigation influenced how police handled future cases. However, the murders also had negative social consequences. Anti-Semitic sentiment in the East End intensified during the autumn of 1888. The large Jewish population, many recent immigrants from Eastern Europe fleeing pogroms, became targets of suspicion and harassment. After the Goulston Street graffito mentioned Jews, some residents blamed the murders on Jewish immigrants. Mobs formed, threatening Jewish businesses and residents. The police had to intervene to prevent violence. While most investigators did not seriously believe the killer was Jewish, the association took root in some minds and contributed to existing prejudices. The murders also reinforced certain Victorian attitudes about women and morality. The fact that all 5 canonical victims were or had been involved in prostitution led some commentators to suggest they had brought their fates upon themselves through immoral behavior. This victim blaming reflected the harsh moral judgments Victorian society imposed on women who transgressed sexual norms. Other commentators, more sympathetic, argued that poverty and lack of opportunities for women had forced these victims into prostitution, emphasizing the social and economic causes of their circumstances rather than moral failings. The terror generated by the murders affected the residents of Whitechapel profoundly. Women were afraid to go out at night. Those who had to, whether for work or other reasons, did so in groups when possible. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion damaged community cohesion. Neighbors accused each other. Any man who appeared suspicious faced harassment. The police received thousands of reports about potential suspects, overwhelming their investigative capacity. The long-term impact of the murders on criminology and criminal investigation cannot be overstated. The Ripper case is often cited as an early example of criminal profiling, though this is somewhat anachronistic. Dr. Thomas Bond, who examined Mary Jane Kelly's body, wrote a report attempting to describe the type of person who might commit such crimes. His assessment, while not a profile in the modern sense, represented an early attempt to infer characteristics of an unknown criminal from the nature of the crimes. The Ripper murders also contributed to the public's understanding of serial murder. While serial killers existed before 1888, the term had not yet been coined, and the concept was not well defined in the public mind. The Ripper murders, because of their serial nature, their apparent lack of conventional motive, and their extensive publicity, helped establish in public consciousness the idea of a killer who murdered repeatedly, who was driven by internal compulsions rather than understandable motives like robbery or revenge. The case also demonstrated the limitations of 19th-century police methods and indirectly spurred developments in forensic science. The inability to catch the Ripper despite massive efforts highlighted the need for better investigative tools. While fingerprinting and other forensic techniques were not adopted immediately, the failures of the Ripper investigation contributed to an environment where such innovations would be welcomed. Fingerprinting was adopted by Scotland Yard in 1901, partly because of recognition that traditional methods were insufficient for certain types of crimes. The cultural impact of the murders extended far beyond Victorian England. Jack the Ripper entered popular culture and never left. The name became synonymous with a certain type of killer: mysterious, brutal, never caught. The Ripper has appeared in countless books, plays, films, and television programs. The murders have been fictionalized, speculated about, and reimagined in virtually every medium. The case has spawned an entire cottage industry of Ripperology, with researchers, historians, and enthusiasts dedicating enormous time and resources to investigating every aspect of the crimes. This enduring fascination raises questions about society's relationship with crime and violence. Why do these particular murders, over a century old, continue to captivate? Part of the answer lies in the mystery. Unsolved cases tantalize. The human mind seeks closure, and the Ripper's identity remains frustratingly elusive. Part of the fascination relates to the Victorian setting. The gaslit streets, the fog, the social contrasts of the era provide an atmospheric backdrop that appeals to modern imaginations. Part connects to the brutality of the crimes themselves, satisfying a morbid curiosity about the darkest aspects of human nature. But there may be a more troubling aspect too: the fascination. The victims are often forgotten in favor of focus on the killer. The women who died, their lives and struggles, are overshadowed by speculation about the man who killed them. Recent works, such as Hallie Rubenhold's book, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper, have attempted to refocus attention on the victims themselves, to tell their stories, and to challenge assumptions about their lives. These efforts represent a necessary corrective to over a century of narratives that centered the killer while marginalizing his victims. The enduring mystery. More than 130 years after the autumn of 1888, Jack the Ripper remains the world's most famous unsolved case. The murders occurred during a period of transformation in criminal investigation, media coverage, and public awareness of crime. They represented a type of serial violence that society was only beginning to understand. They occurred in a place where poverty and desperation created vulnerable victims, and where the geography and social conditions aided a killer who struck and vanished. The canonical 5 victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were real women who suffered real deaths. They were not merely victims of an infamous killer. They were individuals with histories, with families, with struggles and hopes. Their deaths were tragedies first and foremost for them, secondarily for those who knew and cared about them, and only distantly for the society that has turned their murders into legend. The police investigation, despite its failures, represented the best efforts of the Metropolitan Police using the methods available to them. Officers worked tirelessly, pursued countless leads, and attempted to protect further victims. They failed, not because of incompetence necessarily, but because they faced a killer who operated in ways for which they had no precedent, and because the tools of forensic science that might have helped did not yet exist. The press coverage of the murders created much of the legend. The name Jack the Ripper, probably invented by a journalist, proved so memorable that it ensured these crimes would never be forgotten. The sensational reporting brought attention to social conditions in the East End and contributed to reforms, demonstrating that media coverage, however flawed, could serve important purposes beyond mere entertainment or profit. The suspects proposed over the years ranged from credible possibilities to wild speculation. The truth is that we do not know who Jack the Ripper was. We may never know. The passage of time, the loss of evidence, and the limitations of 19th century investigation mean that certainty is likely impossible. Researchers will continue to investigate, to propose theories, to examine evidence, but definitive proof remains elusive. The social impact of the murders extended far beyond the immediate terror they caused. They forced Victorian society to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty and inequality. They contributed to legislative reform and to changes in policing. They influenced how society understood serial violence and how media covered crime. They left a mark on London itself. Many of the locations associated with the murders have been memorialized or marked, and tours of Ripper sites remain popular with tourists. The cultural legacy of Jack the Ripper is complex. The case represents the intersection of crime, mystery, Victorian society, and the birth of modern media. It captures imaginations because of the mystery, the brutality, the historical setting, and the larger questions it raises about society, justice, and human nature. The Ripper has become almost mythological, transformed from whatever individual committed these crimes into a symbol, a representation of evil and mystery that transcends the specific historical events. Yet, amid the legend and the speculation, we should remember the reality. 5 women were murdered in brutal fashion in the autumn of 1888. They died in fear and pain. Their deaths were not romantic or mysterious to them. They were terrifying final moments for individuals who had already endured lives of hardship. Modern fascination with the case should not forget this fundamental human tragedy. The Jack the Ripper murders remain a subject of study not only because of the mystery, but because they offer insights into Victorian society, into the development of criminal investigation, into the role of media in shaping public perception, and into the social conditions that create vulnerability. They serve as a reminder of how poverty and desperation can expose people to danger, of how social neglect can have consequences, and of how society responds when confronted with violence it cannot explain or control. As we look back across more than a century to that autumn of terror, we can recognize that while the killer's identity remains unknown, the impact of the crimes is clear. The Whitechapel murders changed how we think about serial violence, influenced criminal investigation methods, contributed to social reform, and entered the collective consciousness in a way that few crimes have. The mystery endures, the speculation continues, and the name Jack the Ripper remains instantly recognizable. But perhaps the most important legacy should be remembering the victims. Mary Ann Nichols, trying to earn 4p for a bed, proud of her new bonnet. Annie Chapman, chronically ill and desperate for money, promising to return to the lodging house soon. Elizabeth Stride, with her complicated past and uncertain present. Catherine Eddowes, released from a police cell in the early morning and walking toward an appointment with death. Mary Jane Kelly, young and alone in a tiny room in Miller's Court. These were the women who died. Their names and stories deserve to be remembered as much as the mystery of the man who killed them. The autumn of 1888 was a dark time in Whitechapel, a period when terror stalked gaslit streets and when 5 women paid with their lives for the intersection of poverty, circumstance, and the actions of a killer who has never been conclusively identified. The Whitechapel murders remain unsolved. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown, and the mystery endures into the 21st century. The case stands as a reminder of past injustices, of victims who deserve to be honored, and of a mystery that has captured human imagination for more than a century. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Jack the Ripper case. These were real events, involving real people who suffered real tragedies. While the mystery fascinates us, may we never forget the human cost of these crimes and the women whose lives were so brutally ended. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, please share your respectful thoughts in the comments below. Remember to approach this dark chapter of history with the gravity and respect it deserves. For more deep dives into historical mysteries and true crime, subscribe to Lore to Mystery and join our community of history enthusiasts. Until next time, stay curious, stay respectful, and never stop questioning.